Times without that light, it was quite spooky, quite scary. In our scriptures, during the season of Advent, we are taking some time to look back on the other side of the Christmas story. We live currently on the other side of the Christmas story, right? And we know that God is at work and has been at work for some time, but that Christmas so long ago, God sent his son Jesus as a small child in a little town whose only claim to fame really was a garbage heap. You know, if you ever lived in a town whose only claim to fame is a garbage heap, or if you know of the town where the only claim to fame is, that's where Jesus was born. And he sends him, and we know that because we're on this side of the Christmas story. But for centuries, leading up to that point, God was preparing, but had not brought about that which we celebrate at Christmas. And so the people are waiting with great anticipation and great expectation of this coming Messiah. And here Isaiah begins to talk about what has now become known as the Psalms of the Suffering Servant. This is the first one of roughly 4 that are spread throughout parts of Isaiah. The culminating one, the suffering servant, he was wounded for our transgressions, and by his stripes we were healed. We're kind of familiar with that. We'll talk more about that as Easter approaches. But right now, in Isaiah, God is speaking to a people who do not know what is about to come. He is speaking to them. They have, as we learned last week, the nation, God's promised people, have been driven out of the promised land. And God is strangely silent during that period of time. And people like Esther need to then rely upon what they know to be right. And so we come now to this verse, and Isaiah is talking and telling people and reminding people that there is one coming, a servant. But you know what? Something happens between this and the Christmas story. Something that is good for us to remind ourselves. For those of us who stand on this side of the Christmas story, that there was a period of time when all seemed just as dark as that basement with no light on. And the only light that they could really try to hold on to was some idea of a promise. Because God had taken a people who had been no people and had turned them into a mighty nation located in a place that was highly envied. All right? That's why the Assyrians came. That's why the Babylonians came. Right there in the Fertile Crescent, he took this people that had been no people and turned them into a mighty people, a wealthy people, a prominent people. Then in the course of time, they lost that. They began to look and to yearn for this person, this Messiah that would come. The thing is, they were looking for somebody who was going to be powerful, a military leader, some sort of great ruler, somebody that was going to be able to make big decisions and to do mighty, mighty things. And so they had this preconceived notion of what that was going to be like. But God is up to something different. Remember, it says here he's making something new. The former things have already come to pass. I'm doing something new here. And in particular, he describes who this servant is going to be. He's not going to shout or cry out or raise his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not snuff out. In faithfulness he will bring forth justice. That doesn't sound like a political or a military leader, especially when we look at today's standards. Or lack thereof. And no, I'm not pointing to any particular left or right. I'm sick of both of them. Jesus is someone who comes without great shout, without military strength. He comes as a baby. And of all places, a stall. And yes, we have wooden structures, but let me tell you, there isn't a whole lot of wood in Israel. So in all likelihood, he was actually born in a cave, and that nice creche the nice manger that we have, that was probably something carved out of stone. So it's kind of like that stone they have down in Florida. It's all, real soft, and you can kind of sculpt that. This is a little bit harder than that, but that's probably what it was. This is not a king. At least not one by our standards. But here in Isaiah, God doesn't say, I'm bringing forth a king. He says, I'm bringing forth a servant. And he talks about this person, this servant that is to come. At the time that Isaiah is writing this, they're not sure who he's talking about. They can't really pin it to a particular person. But standing on this side of the Christmas story, we know who this is. Do we not? Yes. We know who this servant is that's going to come, who is not going to cry out in the streets or raise his voice, make a big fuss, although he does some things which are quite revolutionary. It says here, where is it? Yeah, I will keep you, this is in verse 6, I will keep you and will make you to be a covenant for the people and a light to the Gentiles, to open the eyes that are blind, to free captives from prison, and to release from the dungeon those who sit in darkness. Back in, if we skip ahead now, well past the Christmas story into Jesus' adulthood, we find that he comes back to Nazareth where he grew up. And he's preaching in the synagogue. And he opens to the prophet Isaiah. And it may not, it's actually not this particular verse, but it might as well be very similar. It's Isaiah 61, verses 1 through 2 that he's preaching. But doesn't this sound about right? The Spirit of the Lord is on me because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind. Hello, didn't we just read that? This is Luke chapter 4, verse 18 and 19. Yeah, see, on this side of the Christmas story, we know that this servant who is to come is Jesus. And he comes to do what? He comes to do this release, to open the eyes of the blind, to free captives from prison, to release from the dungeon those who sit in darkness, to be a light unto the Gentiles. We sing about that. We know that on Isaiah, and we sing about it in Handel's Messiah. We sing about how the people who are sitting in darkness have seen a great light. And that great light is Jesus. But see, here at this time, they don't know that. They have to go by faith. They don't know who this Jesus is. In fact, when he comes, they're not really entirely sure he is who they were hoping that he was. But he comes. He comes. He opens eyes. He frees captives. He releases from dungeons. They don't know who this person is. They don't know entirely what those mean. And so they have faith. They must have faith. Sometime between the time that Isaiah writes these words and the birth of Jesus, there are some 400 years in which God is silent. 400 years. And yet, in the midst of that silence, there are those who still draw hope from this. A hope that they can't explain. A hope which comes from Scripture. A hope which is based on something that they had not seen, but which they nevertheless believe. I think Paul says something about that, doesn't it? Faith is hope in that which we have not seen. Faith during those times. Standing on this side of the Christmas story, we know that this light which is to come brings great hope and great peace and great freedom. If you've ever experienced that, then you know what I'm talking about. If you've ever found yourself in a place where you weren't sure how you were going to get through the next day, or even to the next day. If you've been in a place where you weren't sure how things were going to work out, when the job ended, when the family member passed, when the family member had gone and was lost, maybe you yourself were wandering in the desert waste, looking for things which cannot satisfy. Then you come to that point where you look back and you say, you know, I didn't know it at the time. I wasn't sure at the time. I had my doubts at the time. But God was with me. Jesus was with me. How else do I explain getting from point A? I didn't get from point A to point B. How did I get from point A to point C? And then all those other points in between. How did I possibly get through there? And then you may find yourself even further saying, you know what? Not only did I get from point A to point B, but all these random things which just sort of seem to come out of nowhere, all of a sudden now they fit together in some odd and strange way. And the mistake is that we think that God is being silent, and yet God is very much at work. God didn't say anything during those 400 years, or at least that we count. But you know what? That doesn't mean that God isn't working. God was at work, so that at just the right time for us and our salvation, as the old Nicene Creed says, He sent His only Son. And that is what we celebrate. What we're finding as we go through this season of Advent, I know it's slow and it's tedious, and God days, we just want to get to Christmas. At least get our shopping done, for crying out loud. We get to this point where, it's like, we just want to do this. Let's just step back and say, wait a minute. Isn't this experience, this waiting, this longing, this season of preparation, it had to be that way. It had to be that way. And so we find ourselves on this side of the Christmas story, reading these words in ways that Isaiah himself probably could not have even imagined. That not just the people of Israel, but look what it says over here. It says, where does it say? I will keep you and will make you to be a covenant for the people and a light for the Gentiles. You know what? That's all of us. Now, some of you may have some Jewish blood in you. Great. For the rest of us, this means that none of us are left out of this great hope and love and peace. Nobody gets left out because of nationality or race or anything like that. Everybody is included in this love which is about to be born in, of all places, stinky little Bethlehem. It's so bad, doesn't it? With Andrew that says, can anything good come out of it? Well, actually, he says that about Nazareth. Let me tell you what, Nazareth is not that much of an upgrade, okay? It's not. Yeah. Friends, I shared this at the earlier service, and I think it still applies, even though things have kind of settled down a little bit here with our candles. Some of us, especially at this time of the year, we need to draw closer to each other. We really do. Some of us are battling. They've got a name for this type, seasonal disorder or something of that nature. And it's a difficult time for a lot of people for a lot of reasons. For some people, it will be the first Christmas that they are spending without a loved one. For others, it may be the 20th or the 30th or the 40th year without a loved one. It is still difficult. Prayers and my thoughts are with you, especially those of you who've lost loved ones this year. It's a difficult time because the change in the climate, and I don't know, maybe it has something to do with this whole daylight savings time. It gets darker sooner, and it's just that time of the year. We're just not at our game. And you know what happens with us when we start feeling kind of low or kind of down? What do? We isolate. We pull back. You know? We don't want to be around people. Now, if you're very extroverted, sure, you want to be around people. But even the most extroverted person can decide, you know what, I'm just not happy enough to see anybody, and they need to see me happy. No, they don't. They need to see you. They need to see you. You may not be happy in that particular moment. You may, and I'm not making light of what anybody is going through when I say happy, but you may not be in a very good place, but people still need to see you. Why? Well, in part so that they can minister to you without judgment. They can minister to you, but also so that you can minister to them. Because there may be somebody going through a worse time than you. And they need to see that you're getting through it. That's why as members, we pledge to support the ministries of the church through our prayers and our presence, meaning being around. And there's something that happens when you're around people, and maybe don't hang around necessarily with just people that are going through a hard time. Find that one guy that's going to laugh and smile and go, what's going on? Because it's just like these candles right over here. When I lit that thing, it wasn't lit, it didn't have a little lighter on the thing. What I had to do is I had to take it and I had to hold it up next to this flame over here, didn't I? And then I didn't just have the one or two flames, then I had a third one, didn't I? And there was more light. And then I took that one and I lit a candle. And how did I light the candle? I held the flame up next to the one that wasn't lit. And then what happened? That one caught on fire. And it's a funny thing that we have different lengths over here, and it's not because of how much oil is in there. I think they both all have the same kind of oil, but their wick's a little bit shorter than others. You may be around somebody that's the wick isn't that long, but you know what? If they're on fire, and you stand up next to that, what's going to happen? It'll catch on fire. It's warm. Let me tell you, it's warm right there. And maybe there's one that's got a bigger flame. Something like this. Somebody that's really on fire for whatever reasons. You stand around and you get up close to this. Guess what? You're going to catch on fire. It's just like that with the light. This light, this flame. God does not want us to be isolated and separated from one another, but to be together and united, to keep each other lit, so to speak, to be a light for not only other people, but for ourselves and gathered together. This is great news of hope and great news of love. Isaiah is speaking from that time before the Christmas story. And this next week, we're going to start getting into the whole story of Christmas. And with Mary and Joseph and the shepherds and all that. We're going to get into that story and relive all that. But even when that isn't going on, we can still have brothers and sisters, may this season, even with its difficulties, even with the pressures and the stress, may we find hope and peace and love through Jesus Christ. May we share that with ourselves, but may we also share that to all the world. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Our Our closing hymn is number 240, Hark the Herald Angels Sing. Number 240. Let's stand and join in this song. Join with the singing of the angels.